our last event in this room came, this was in the last 2 seconds almost. It's just like bad. I mean, regardless of turnout, I mean, you get to do this, right? That's not like even one person comes, still a reason to have another meeting. Hello. What's up, Tyler? For sure.
Overcome.
Cool.
Excuse me.
No, I'm just looking.
Oh, yeah. You saw the presentation beforehand, right?
I saw the slides.
Gotcha.
And I heard about it.
Yeah. All right.
Do you, it's recording now?
Yeah, it should be at least.
Okay. There's no the light that's
That
the
plus also
recording
the
light.
blinking light on the right. So yeah, it's working.
Very orange. That's very
Everybody say hi.
Sorry.
Thank you all very, very much for your attendance here this evening. It means very much to me. I'm president of this club, Loyola Rhetoric Society. It means very much to all of us who have helped set up this event and many others that we've been lucky enough to have this semester. And I know, I will speak on his behalf, I know it means very, very much to our presenter here this evening, Karl. And that leads me to Karl and what Karl's doing here tonight. So the Loyola Rhetoric Society positions itself within this university to be a forum for any and all types of discussion, debate, disagreement, argumentation, conversation, reflection, discernment, any and all types of communication, either with yourself or with other people, are not only coveted but cherished here at this society. And the society, as a entity in and of itself, takes no political stance. It demurs no participation, regardless of the affiliation that it may hold. And in fact, we encourage our respective members within the society to speak and use this forum as a platform to speak on what their own rhetorical insights and perspectives are. And now more than ever is very, very important, of course. Tomorrow is Tuesday, the election day, something we all know very, very much about, or at least have read forcefully very, very much about. Here tonight is Karl Dehmelt. He is a junior. He is not a professor. He is a student in writing. And he is actually an Apprentice House author. He has 2 books, right? And I'm sure in his free time he would love to tell you about them. But we have a pretty amazing opportunity here tonight to hear from Loyola's best and brightest doing what we covet very, very much, which is rhetorical insight. And so without further ado, I'd like to present Karl Dehmelt and his rhetorical insight on Donald Trump reversing the argument. Thanks, Karl.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Zach. And I would also like to say thank you to everybody for coming out the day before the election. That's why when originally the Rhetoric Society approached me to give this talk, which was actually originated in my rhetoric class, special topics in rhetoric, I was like, yeah, that's pretty good kairos right there. That's good timing right beforehand, because it's literally the day before the next president of the United States is elected. And this is actually going to kind of echo the sentiments of 2 other events that happened here at Loyola, the first one of which was a debate panel that was put together by the Rhetoric Society, which attempted to take an objective stance on multiple issues. And then the second event was Karl Dehmelt's dissection of this year's election and how it's kind of atypical in the history of the United States to have the situation that we find ourselves in now. So, on that note, the original assignment which I was tasked to complete was basically take something in the political sphere and then analyze what it's doing in a rhetorical sense. So for me, the easiest choice was, well, one of the 2 major party candidates is someone who has never been an elected official before. It's someone who presents themselves as a distinct political outsider. And for reasons related to his strategies and also the response to the American public, he's the nominee of the Republican Party, and I'm talking, of course, of Mr. Donald Trump. Now, while this presentation is presented in somewhat of a, I want to say, comical, maybe tongue-in-cheek fashion, the main reason for doing that is due to the fact that I, similar to the Rhetoric Society, really don't hold a political affiliation one way or the other. My entire job as the presenter and my entire job as someone who's a voter, at least from my opinion, or in my opinion, is to be as analytic and as objective as possible to try to find what's actually going on. So, while the theme of the presentation is, of course, centered around Donald Trump and the fact that he has, in somewhat of a maverick way, if you will, joined this election cycle and taken over one of the political parties, I'm also going to be talking about Hillary Clinton and how she fits into this entire equation as well. So without further ado, let's get started. So the arc that I'm talking about, right? So what is the arc? And this is literally something that I drew in basically using word art to try to get this opinion across, or this analysis across, because the way that I look at it is, this is how I try to think. So when I'm told to evaluate something and come up with a conclusion to what I think something is, I start with the facts, right? And then I form my initial opinion from those facts. I look at different sources that I think are reputable, and I'm one of those people, when I don't know something, I try to read and see what other people are saying, because I'm of the opinion that it's okay for, in my objective evaluation, to be wrong, number one, and number two, for me to be able to learn things. So I form an opinion, then I analyze exactly what's going on. I cross-reference my opinion with like-minded individuals, and then I go and I see what other people are saying who are opposite the position that I've taken for whatever reason. And then I come to a conclusion. And this is very analytical because, and I think one of the reasons why I consider myself to be different from party affiliations, because I will not simply vote for someone because they are of a certain party. I won't necessarily align myself with someone because they're a certain way. I see everything in its own kind of ad hoc evaluation, and that's what I tried to apply to both these candidates in this election. Now, something that makes Donald Trump so effective is that this is not the arc that he's mastered and that he's presented in this election. And I would also argue that it's not the arc that many politicians use, because they kind of flip the arc and put it on its head. So when we're talking about either Donald Trump, and this can, again, go for any politician, Hillary Clinton, anybody else who've tried to use a political movement to reach a lot of people, this is what they do. So they start their conclusion, right? They present themselves to be what they believe themselves to be. There's no room for this entire thought-building process of making objective facts. They have to tell you what they are and do that in the least amount of time possible with the most efficacy possible. And then to kind of build up this conclusion, they support with facts, which have an asterisk next to it, because we'll get to that in a second, their reputation, their chironic timing, their rhetoric, and then their capitalization on a moment. So this takes the entire idea of we're supposed to be looking at everything for what is and agreeing on what is and having this definition stage, and that's not how politics works at all. And the reason it doesn't work that way is because when people pay attention to politics, a lot of them don't take the time to do that kind of investigative research that I'm kind of talking about that's necessary to create a truly objective opinion. Now, you can't really blame them for doing that because a lot of people don't have time, right? That's one angle to take it from. Or the other angle is that then, when people start thinking like this, and when they start seeing things from the conclusion without thinking analytically, we can get ourselves into some pretty interesting situations as a collective. So this is the model that I was then going to take and then say, when I'm thinking of Donald Trump being an effective politician, because that's what he is now, how exactly did somebody with no political background in the establishment manage to do this so well? And this first step that he presented, of course, was the conclusion. So we have this idea of who Donald Trump is, basically from his public reputation in the lexicon of America and the entire world to start. And in one sense, he wants to make America great again. So we already know who he is. We know he's had national best-selling books. He's a real estate mogul. He's someone who has been in the public conversation for close to 40 years at this point. He's a leader, he's a negotiator, and he's a Washington outsider. And he presents himself as success. So in every single time that you've heard Donald Trump's name and that kind of stuff, it's either been with the amount of money he's been able to accrue, it's been with the amount of deals he's been able to make, and it's been with these very, very popular television shows that he's been able to have millions of people get an idea of who he is from these media outlets. So this is him before the election, essentially. But then when you start looking at exactly what he does, right, and this is going to go again for both candidates, but in Trump's case specifically, you get into the conversation of what a fact is. And now, while this seems to be something that's pretty simple, where it's like, well, a fact is something that happened, it's like salient information, but that's not how it works. Facts are something that when you present somebody with the same story or the same amount of information, it can actually be interpreted in multiple ways. So for instance here, this is from PolitiFact, by the way, the Pulitzer Prize-winning fact-checking organization. Donald Trump says he has a fiduciary responsibility to his business, his family, and his employees to pay no more tax than legally required, right? And now PolitiFact is saying that this doesn't exist, according to these experts that they've asked. So while this isn't true, right, but to someone who doesn't do research, Trump is a businessman. And some people assume that Trump is a good businessman. So when Donald Trump says something like this, the likelihood of somebody challenging him when they know him already to be a businessman and then someone who's been successful in the world goes down. Then number two, in her campaign for president, Hillary Clinton has received $100 million in contributions from Wall Street and hedge funds. So the counter-argument from the fact-checking source to this is that no figures exist to back that figure, ironically. And this isn't provable, but it capitalizes on the fact that Hillary Clinton, as an entity, is perceived in a much different way than Donald Trump. She's the epitome of what some people cannot stand about the Washington establishment in her public persona. Somebody who's been insider for the past, 40 years, who was involved in the White House as not just a first lady, but as almost an extension of Bill Clinton's agenda, and then also as someone who has been involved allegedly, and also, I can say provably, in some corrupt practices, or what we would consider to be unethical practices. And then Trump's reputation as a businessman, when he's calling out Hillary Clinton like this, you're more likely to listen to him, or an observer who isn't going to investigate as much is more likely to listen to him because of his ethos. And now this is the one where it was like, okay, because one of the common things in this election has been Donald Trump has said some things that are not necessarily factually true, and then how far does that go? This is one where he was like, I finished the controversy about where President Barack Obama was born. So, okay, he claims that, but the thing is, even though it's a lie, the fact that he said that and the fact he's able to claim it is actually more, I don't want to say more effective than the truth, but it actually supersedes the truth because the lie is more popular, he's tweeted about it a lot, and people would need to do research to debunk this, and they won't. That's just how it goes. So, this is how you turn a lie into the truth in 7 easy steps. So the first lie that I'm going to reference here is that our veterans, in many cases, are being treated worse than illegal immigrants. Right? So that's the claim that he's making. That's 100% false, according to the objective fact-checking source. Now, make it seem possible, right? Not plausible, but just a possibility. Put it in the realm of something that could happen. So you have cases of veterans not being served at VA hospitals, right? You have cases of veterans living on the street, veterans committing suicide at high rates, and you have illegal immigrants plus the Trump base and how they're perceived among his supporters. And then you appeal to this emotion, right? Where veterans are a commonly respected group, number one, and then number two, people care about the troops. Number four, you give it publicity, which he definitely has the platform to do. You repeat it a lot, and then you make the alternative dependent on a proactive audience. And I keep going back to this point because everything that I've talked about in terms of making an objective appraisal of something that's presented to you requires the person receiving the information or the conclusion to do something, right? And then you rinse and repeat this. And the lie isn't and never will be the truth when it's perceived in this way. For instance, if someone were to take that tweet and not look at PolitiFact, not go and see how there are so many intertwining complexities that make this what it is, if they just take it at face value, right, This will never be the truth, but it's just as good as the truth. And as a matter of fact, it's now regarded as in the same way as something which is true because people believe it to be true. So regardless of the fact that this is factual or not, which it's not, people see this, and then if they take it as the truth, it's as good as the truth. But Karl, what if the media or anyone else challenges these conclusions? Right? And we have this wonderful caricature of Donald Trump building a wall. So this is the reputation portion of all this. And this is from Business Insider. So in the past, businesses relied on word of mouth by their stakeholders in order to establish, build, and maintain their reputation. But in this modern age of social networking, websites, and other methods of instant communication, businesses must be conscientious of their reputations on a constant basis and be responsive to any crisis that may have an impact on their reputation. So again, pre-election, here's what we commonly understood Donald Trump to be. He's a successful man, and pretty much an American archetype in that regard. He's a business magnate, real estate mogul, influential figure. He stood with presidents, you know, just a couple people who might be other familiar faces in this election season. And this whole idea of these two people being separate in terms of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump is actually a rather new idea because in terms of Donald Trump's political affiliation, he used to affiliate as a Democrat, and obviously, you know, the fact that his daughter and Hillary Clinton's daughter are somewhat friends, a bunch of other things that you can kind of say, this isn't as black and white as it appears to be. There's something else going on in terms of how that relationship unfolded, right? But now current, these are all things that I've heard repeated multiple times about Donald Trump. He doesn't buy the political correctness. He tells it like it is. He's a Washington outsider. He knows how to work the system to his advantage, which is also very important. He's got 20-plus generals endorsing him, and he's going to not only not work inside the system, but he's going to change the system to somehow be less of a closed pay-to-play network, and say he's going to turn into something that anybody can understand. It's no longer going to be just for the elite. And now, the bed of nails effect is something which I did pull from John Oliver, where he said basically, and this has been a phenomenon in many of the political journalists watching this, where it's like, how is Donald Trump able to say some of the things that he says? And the answer is it's kind of easy, because the bed of nails effect argues that when you say a bunch of things, like if you stab yourself with a nail one time, it's going to hurt. But if you walk on a bed of nails and you evenly distribute the weight, it's not going to hurt as much. Therefore, that when you do these so many times, that becomes the thing that you're known for, where it's like, oh, Donald Trump's going to tell it how it is and that kind of stuff. He's going to say things that would disqualify any career politician, but when he does it enough and then he markets that almost as like to be concurrent with his brand, you get a situation like this. And the point of contact between Trump's conclusions and presentation is a much shorter distance than the one between people and the truth. And that's true with every politician. Because if someone's going to sit there and say, well, what do I think about an issue? If someone's going to do all their research and include facts and present it to them and basically do the work for them, then they don't have to be proactive at all. And then they can just take that to be the truth, even if it's not. And then what's real doesn't even matter if people feel a certain way. Which, for those of us who try to build, purely on objective facts, that's kind of terrifying, but it is also how it is. So that's all well and good, but why is this working now? Aren't we supposedly enlightened? And this is Donald Trump shaving the head of Vince McMahon, which is another interesting side note. The chaotic timing now is where we get to step 3 in this arc. So 4 in 10 Americans trust the mass media, and this ties 2014-2012 for the lowest trust level in Gallup's trend, and younger Americans, like us, are less likely to trust the media for all these examples. So that's Gallup explaining how the media landscape, which used to be the way in which a lot of people got their information, or the way in which people put their trust in something other than themselves, is now not as trustworthy nearly as it was before. And that's the key point of this, because people hate and distrust the media. People widely perceive politicians to be crooked, and most importantly, people widely perceive Hillary Clinton to be crooked. Everything's instant, we live in a highlight culture, and this kind of echoes what Dr. Jameson said during her presentation, because she was talking about now, the debates aren't even really about whoever is going to outline the policies better and that kind of stuff. It's going to be who can make the statement that gets the most views and the most circulation. So it's moving away from those objective policies that we're talking about. And there have been roots of disenfranchisement brewing in the GOP for years. The Tea Party, the anti-Obama rhetoric, and the 2012 elections, may I remind you, 50 to 47% in favor of President Obama in the popular vote. So this was already close in a traditional stance, but the exact division and exactly how easily it could swing between the either conservative or liberal points of thought, it was a lot closer than a lot of people think, because that's only 3 percentage points between the two of them. So then, even though people hate the media, right, here's the real kicker of Trump's effectiveness. Trump's saturation of the media with his quips, quotes, and brand It's propelled Trump to be the spark on the powder keg of dissent, broiling in some of the members of the GOP for years. He came and did this at the exact perfect time. And from the Stanford University School of Business, negative publicity can increase sales when a product or company is relatively unknown simply because it stimulates product awareness. So every time that Donald Trump was getting his name mentioned in the media as a politician, right, being correlated with someone running for the presidency of the United States, he was helping himself, even if these would have stung any other politician, because he wasn't a politician at that point. And now again, the Kairos. Hillary Clinton, seen as the insider of all insiders, part of a political dynasty, corrupt, and either has a track record or has been engineered a track record by the conservative media, take your pick, which paints her reputation to be a certain way. Now, that point is interesting to note, because depending on who you get your news from, which is another thing we have now, if you listen to, say, InfoWars versus the Young Turks or something like that, you can choose almost what the reputation of this person is based on where you get your information from. And the objective truth about Hillary Clinton, I think, can only be appraised in a light that's nonpartisan from a source that's nonpartisan. So, I believe there were 3 books that were written about the first Clinton administration, which, you know, just Bill Clinton. We don't know if Hillary Clinton's going to become the second Clinton administration. But the one by Christopher Hitchens talking about not only the way Bill Clinton was involved in triangulation in American politics, but also how Hillary Clinton was an extension of that, I would definitely recommend reading that book. And that's actually, I'm trying to remember exactly which journalist was talking about the 3 most important books of the Clinton era, but that was one, because I mean, that book will open up your eyes about a lot of things that are not presented in the same way, the same narrative that we're talking about in terms of entertainment. This is coming from a reputable journalist in 1999. So that's right. It doesn't matter if Clinton did the thing she's accused of doing or not, right? If people, and that's enough people, believe them to be true, they're as good as factual, as I mentioned before, if not better, because they can be extrapolated easier than facts. See, when facts happen and people accept things to be factual, it's kind of hard to change what happened. But when people make up what happened and they kind of like create a story which is malleable in a sense, it's easier to change that than it is with just facts. And the big problem is, Hillary Clinton has objectively engaged in corruptions. And to quote Hitchens again, he doesn't believe that she's met a foreign political donor that she's ever not liked. So this is the real conundrum of this, because when Trump talks about being a political outsider, he talks about the corruption inside Washington and stuff, he's running against what many, many people believe to be the hegemonic paragon of what corruption and insiderness and pay-to-play in Washington is. So this makes every single thing that he's saying that much more effective because of who he's running against. And this is something which really, I brought this up because when Mike Mueller from the Los Angeles Times came in and gave his talk that he did, you know, here's someone who's been a White House correspondent and dealt with the most powerful people objectively in the United States. And I asked him this question, where it's like, you know, I heard another journalist make the observation that there really is no objective bulwark anymore. Like, there's no source where people can go to and say, these people are going to present facts no matter what. The New York Times can be dismissed as liberal hacks. Fact-checking by CNN don't mean the Clinton News Network, which is another key point. John Oliver's a liberal puppet. You know, the Harvard GOP Student Association, who for the first time in their history didn't endorse the GOP nominee. They're from a college. Colleges are liberal. Who cares? John McCain is a Washington insider. He plays for the same team as Hillary. George Bush, another political dynasty. People can rationalize absolutely anything. And if enough people believe the same false narrative, it can, to them, become as good as the truth. And that goes for both sides. That's the kind of sensationalism that you see in American politics from both Democrats and Republicans. Now, the other interesting part of this equation is the internet, right? And this is something which I've read, and especially from, again, Dr. Jameson's talk, about how this has truly impacted the election. You know, this is the whole basket of deplorables comment that Hillary Clinton made, which I don't believe to be accurate, but anybody who's sitting on the internet and truly wants to, right, because of the instantaneousness provided by the information network, if they have time, they have money, and they have means, and a lot of resentment for the establishment, plus motivation, they can make it their goal to devote themselves to either, one, researching information, or two, putting out content that's going to be seen by a lot of people. And if that's all they're doing, it's almost as good as having another wing of a political campaign working pro bono, essentially. And there was a Reddit AMA that happened with Paul Joseph Watson from InfoWars. I don't know if you know who that is, but he is somebody who usually has like a beard. He's kind of like has a British accent and that kind of stuff. And he has videos which are praising, you know, the liberal narrative and then responding to them. He literally talked about how he spends the absolute majority of his time sitting in his room, doing research, doing all this other kind of stuff. And he's showing that because of the internet and the way in which it makes everything so instantaneous, which again you can parallel to our culture, here's an example of an entirely different political, I want to say like a different arm of the political apparatus that never existed before. So the game is completely different than traditional politics at this point. But then, people have always been mostly apathetic. There's the economic concept of rational ignorance. And of course people want easy answers. Why is this having such an impact with Trump? Well, because of his rhetoric. And now, this is a statement that doesn't necessarily even need to be applied directly to Trump, but manipulating people is somewhat easy and depends on three things. The use of emotion, having a platform, and striking when the iron is hot. According to Aristotle in his work of Rhetoric, an emotional speaker always makes his audience feel with him, even when there is nothing in his arguments, which is why many speakers try to overwhelm their audience by mere noise. Now, thinkprogress.org identified Donald Trump as a master of classical rhetoric, and that's what Plato called the art of winning the soul by discourse. And this is the kind of classical example that Plato uses. If a rhetorician and a doctor visited any city you like to name, and they had to contend in argument before the assembly or any other gathering, as to which of the two should be chosen as a doctor, the doctor would be nowhere, but the man who could speak would be chosen if he so wished. And the pause there is because you have someone who is, by all standards and all evaluations, a doctor. Like, that's what he is. But if he can present himself in a way that is lesser to someone who knows how to talk, the other person then becomes the doctor by the evaluation. Then how many current politicians can you name that have been intentionally using key figures of speech for 40 years? In Donald's case, his preferred figure is hyperbole, or rather truthful hyperbole, as he labels it in his 1987 bestseller, The Art of the Deal. And now this is Donald Trump speaking in The Art of the Deal. The final key to the way I promote is bravado. I play to people's fantasies. People may not always think big themselves, but they still get very excited by those who do. That's why a little hyperbole never hurts. People want to believe that something is the biggest and the greatest and the most spectacular. I call it truthful hyperbole. It's an innocent form of exaggeration and a very effective form of promotion. Now, the idea of truthful hyperbole is that, as I mentioned at the start, if you make something that is kind of objectively true, and then you drag it through the means of rhetorical persuasion, and then you present it as something that it's not, but it could be, that's how you reach the stage like this. Mm-hmm. And now, why does this work in this age, right? The desire for instant information makes people less likely to counter conclusions via analytic thought. We take things completely at face value almost at this point. Feelings distort the truth, and we usually want to put our own narratives first. This is the easiest thing to say as someone who's engaged in these discussions and that kind of stuff. Like, all of us are a little inherently selfish, and we all have that kind of subjectivity to think that because we're putting something forward, even if we don't realize it, we think that our presentation then has some kind of worth that may be better than other opinions, just to ourselves, right? But Trump knows exactly what he's doing in some aspects and what he was doing, and he has no idea what he's doing in others, but the problem is we can't tell the difference, and the bigger problem is it doesn't matter. So there's been a bunch of debates where it's like, well, okay, Trump's not really a master rhetorician because he doesn't know that he's going to have this effect on people. But when you look at the way in which it's played out, it doesn't really matter. He's got the nomination of the Republican Party. He could win the presidency tomorrow night. And it doesn't really matter if he knew what he was doing or not. It was one of the most effective ways to counter the traditional political narrative that we've seen in this country's history. And he could do almost anything at this point, and people, at least 40%, this is a little bit outdated because, I made the presentation back when the 40% number was being touted, like, oh, Trump can't get over 40% or whatever. But even if the majority of the country, even if that many people have already bought into this or have already believed him to be that conclusion, then they'll still support him. He said that he could literally walk out in the middle of the street and shoot someone. People would still probably support him, and he's not wrong. So then, since what he says is based in fact, it's not black and white in terms of what's true and what's not, he's riding the same wave that Bernie Sanders was trying to use, but just using a different surfboard. And xenophobia, bigotry, misogyny, and hatred have all been benignly sitting underneath the nation for years. This is on both sides again. Trump didn't really cause it, and he didn't really cause it directly, although people like him have. He's just using it and making it 10 times worse. And this is where you talk about, again, the mix between facts and what's not, because on one hand, you can call Islamophobia the way in which Donald Trump is saying that, Muslims should be let into the country, but then you also notice the fact that he's saying radical Islamic terrorism when other elected officials will not. So depending on how you appraise those facts, it could be seen as xenophobia, bigotry, and misogyny, and I'd argue objectively that it is. But on the other hand, if you're of the opposite narrative, you can rationalize that being, he's just being smart about it. Why would we let in people who could potentially harm us? Now, step 5, and the most important part, is capitalization, right? And this is really how it could go tomorrow, depending on how people form their opinions. Trump wins if people use the lesser of two evils and believe Trump to be the lesser evil. The undecided voter's faith or lack thereof causes them to split the base of his opposition, so Democrats don't get as many votes. And then objectively intelligent people vote for him due to independently concluding he's superior to Clinton. And then Clinton wins is almost the opposite. But she has to escape her reputation more than Trump does. Because the people who are supporting Trump aren't going to look at his reputation and say, I don't really want to support him. Whereas people looking at Hillary Clinton and going, well, she's a Democratic nominee, but she has this insane amount of corruption. She has all these things that have been said about her, and her record as part of the establishment is going to detract some people, I would say, who voted for or supported Bernie Sanders, maybe away from the Clinton campaign, because it is what it is. Not to mention the amount of corruption that the DNC used in the primary between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. Someone with 30 years in the business, the potentially corrupt business, is better than an amateur with questionable temperament, and people delay their desire to bust the system for 4 years to prevent Trump from taking office. Now, I'm going to leave with this final statistic, and I know it is the day before the election. Personally, I've already sent my absentee ballot, but this, I believe, is the most important part to mention, because while the political system in the United States is a two-party system, that's the narrative that's been presented to us. And the reason this statistic I'm going to show is so kind of shocking is due to the fact that when people make their objective decisions and that kind of stuff, then maybe they could go with one party or the other. But there are so many people out there who believe that their vote doesn't matter. And in some senses, when you look at the local elections and things of that nature in terms of gerrymandering or potentially the rate of incumbents staying in office when they don't get elected out of office because it's kind of impossible for them to, or for a Democrat to win in a district that's been designed to be primarily Republican. On the national level, this is only somewhat true because the popular vote and the Electoral College, while they don't directly correlate, they're still extremely, extremely important when you look at how many people didn't vote. So, the number of eligible voters who did not vote in 2012's general presidential election was 93 million. And the reason I leave that as my final thought is due to the fact, as I said, as long as people are using that kind of analytic thought and then they're bringing their conclusions to be either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, that's fine. But the real enemy, I would argue here, is the apathy that we're talking about. And I mentioned rational ignorance before in passing, but that's the idea that the government is basically so complicated and so bureaucratic that people can rationalize not understanding it and then using that to be the limitation of their analysis. And for me, that just doesn't work because these are the things that are really important, and even though there is a kind of a gridlock between the executive office and the legislative branch, and maybe the judicial branch, depending on what happens, it's still really important. If we're believing in democracy whatsoever with any kind of hopeful connotation, that we exercise that right, make our decisions, and then go and do something about it. So, that's it for today.
As I said, thank you all very much for coming. Karl, thank you. I want to offer an opportunity. So as I said in my introduction speech, the Loyola Rhetoric Society is not an organization willing or wanting to voice its particular opinion, but merely offer an opportunity for individuals to rhetorically analyze, to make their own presentations, to make their own inquiries, and also debate, of course. And so what we just saw was an individual within the society make a presentation about something he has researched himself, he himself believes, and he himself has offered. And so I'd like to offer an opportunity, if anyone has any direct questions for Karl, that would be, now is your opportunity, I guess, to do what rhetoric is best at, which is weighing what was presented with what you believe and comparing the two. So if there are any questions now, please feel free to make those known.
I know I had questions, I just don't remember them right now.
Yeah, what's
What
up?
are you voting for?
I'd rather not say. I
That's fair.
reserve my own privacy.
What do you think the relationship is between what we've seen over the past months in the presidential election and the rise of kind of, like reality television culture? Do you see a correlation? Do you not see a correlation?
Well, I think it's interesting because one of the main, oh my goodness, evaluations of what's happening in terms of Trump's rise to, his prominence has been, he was actually a reality television star on multiple occasions, The Apprentice and Celebrity Apprentice, plus everything else that he's done. But when you take a look at what reality television is, it's kind of understood to be, at least if you're looking at it, like, is this actual reality or not, or is it scripted, or is it produced to look a certain way? Reality television doesn't really do a good job of reflecting a whole lot about reality. And in this case, while that has been the means by which Trump has injected himself into the public conversation, you know, there's a lot about him in terms of not only his principles, which he puts forth, but also like the issues that he's talking about that's very, very real. Now, depending on which side you ask, either Donald Trump's supporters and them are building a narrative to an America that doesn't exist, or conversely, Hillary Clinton's supporters and that kind of stuff are building a narrative to an America that doesn't exist. So you have these two different interpretations kind of going back and forth with each other, and then the way we interpret reality television, if you buy into like what the reality television narrative is, you could say, oh, that is actual reality, that's what they're looking at. Or you could sit there and say, you know, this isn't really true at all, and it's just all mass-produced and that kind of stuff. So I would argue that I think that there's a distinct pair and like similarities between the two, but I think it's like correlation versus causation and that kind of stuff, where reality television hasn't necessarily led to the rise of Trump, but he's definitely used his role in it to bring himself to more of a like prominent role in discussion.
So who here has voted already? Pretty good. Who is planning to vote tomorrow? Okay, can I ask, if that's all right, who here is abstaining from voting? Who here would not like to vote? Is there anyone here who does not want to vote? Interesting. That's good. That's good. And so that leads me into a question, which I hope to you guys you can engage Karl with. But what about that figure at the end, 93 million in 2012? They went through the long process, filling out stuff to vote, but they didn't actually vote. Is that surprising, or is that not? Did that surprise you, Karl?
Well, that actually came originally because I was tasked to do a speech on actually apathy in Dr. Goodell's class last year. And when I found that statistic, I believe it was 65 million people voted for President Obama, and then I think either between 61 and 63 million voted for Romney. And then you notice that the people who didn't vote is almost 30 million more than either of the shown support through the act of voting for either of the two major candidates. And that thought's kind of mind-blowing to me, as I said, because you could argue that those 93 million would go one direction or the other, but I'd rather make the argument that if these people really didn't either care enough to vote and that kind of stuff, or they thought that, oh, you know, I'm not going to be able to change much of anything, if only those 93 million people had voted in one way, or even just said, you know what, let's just, if this were an option, let's just get rid of these two candidates and start over again, they would have won by over 30 million votes. That intrigues me.
Is that surprising for you? Yeah. Cool.
It's a different question, but go ahead. Yeah.
Well, if that's yeah, the floor's open.
I was just wondering, Karl, what's the solution? Like, it seems almost as if the rhetorical era that we breathe is such that, you know, we're kind of primed to look at sources that confirm our already held beliefs, that we surround ourselves with people who agree with us. Like, in doing this research, did you kind of figure out, like, what you or any of us could do individually to try to change the dynamic here?
So this is probably, like, I would argue that the way in which my original, like, political opinion, that kind of stuff was formed was almost completely opposite to that, because I was someone who identified, because my parents were Democrats, right, in most ways. I was somebody who originally, like, identified myself with more liberal beliefs and that kind of stuff, and I was in a town in Pennsylvania which had 150 kids in the graduating class. Majority, I think we had one black student in our entire class, and the conservative amount of, like, and again, they were conservative views, but they were conservative views from kids who had gotten them from their parents kind of before that ability to rationalize on their own was there. But I learned from a very early era where it's like, well, I mean, just because my parents are Democrats doesn't really mean that I should be one. Like, what is that? Like, that's not me making my own opinions. So then I started getting into, like, the, like, idea of not only watching debates with people who were after that same objective truth that I keep mentioning and that kind of stuff, like Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins. I don't really identify with their religious beliefs and that kind of stuff, because even their arguments can be flawed in that regard. The thing I love about them, and the thing I love about people who think like that, is because they see this more as like an individualistic pursuit that then makes up a majority, that you don't, as an individual, have to conform with the majority or not. Now the question is, how do you get people to think like that, right? And how do you get them to come to this idea to almost hold the same standard of society and go, you know what? We're not really going to be a Democrat because people we know are Democrats. We're not just going to talk to people who agree with us. We're going to be kind of like brave and defend our assertions and that kind of stuff. And I would argue that that kind of intellectual pursuit is something that distinctly, the role of the university in the United States is something that needs to be like at the forefront of what we're doing here in discussions like this and having the ability. Because when you look at that, you know, your opinions, I forget exactly who said this, but your opinions aren't really opinions until they've been tested by dialogue and that kind of stuff. And you've had to defend something with evidence. And the thing about evidence and the way this line of thought runs is that you've had people from conservative ideologies, liberal ideologies, who have reached these conclusions using that almost method of inquiry, right? And as long as we're still inside this kind of world that says you don't need to do that, you can make these decisions and they're going to be just as good as people who sit there and analyze all the facts, who go through and talk to people who they don't know even, but who oppose their views, until that kind of, like, until they see the benefits of doing that, rather than the safety of just agreeing with people who are like them, like, until that happens, or until somebody, and maybe this will be the point where it's like, you know what, how did the system even potentially return these two candidates for president? Well, the answer is because people weren't thinking that way, I don't think. So, in order to have that discussion, I think it's going to require more people to realize the importance of having that analytic thought, of being brave enough to put their issues out there, to have them tested by other people, and honestly not being afraid to be wrong. Because I've been wrong about many things, and the only way that I've been able to learn on that kind of stuff is to go and not consider my opinion to be important because it's my opinion, to go listen to people who know more than I do, and then try again.
Any other questions that we could pose to Karl? Please.
Do you think that if Bernie had been a Democratic candidate, that Trump would have been as successful in his rhetoric?
So the interesting part about Bernie Sanders, for taking him as what he's presented himself to be, right? When you look at his political record between him, Clinton, and Trump, just for sake of argument, he's the person who, for better or for worse, whether you agree with his policies or not, has tried to stay true, I would argue, the most to what he's been and what he's done in terms of how he's voted, in terms of policy, in terms of what he's believed in. And the interesting part about Sanders is that he was never a traditional Democrat. He was an independent. And the reason, I think, why he was an independent, if I can say, is because he never really needed to align himself with the Democratic Party back where he was a senator, right? Because the people there didn't really need to, like, they understood him to be as he was and voted for him because he was a certain way, not because he was a Democrat. But then when you did the primary between Clinton and Sanders, this is where that, like, huge story about how the DNC potentially manipulated the outcome of that election via either if they actually manipulated it and that was actually a cause for why Clinton won, or even the fact that a political organization that's supposed to be non-biased was so favored towards Hillary Clinton. That's a big question because Sanders, like I said, was running on the same kind of like, oh, I'm not part of the establishment. We're trying to start a revolution. He said that over and over and over again. And as I said, his revolution and Donald Trump's revolution in that kind of spirit of wanting to change the system, I don't believe are that different. So if you were to have said that Sanders would have won, right, then you'd have two candidates who are running who are both not part of the establishment. You've got Trump, who's an outsider, and Sanders saying, you know, I've been true to myself here. I haven't been crooked. I haven't done all these other things these politicians have done. I've been, like, almost the example of what these people aren't in terms of morals and ethics and that kind of stuff. Then it would come down to, well, where are all the people who are part of the establishment going to go? To the one person who doesn't follow the establishment or the other? And number two, which one of them do you think has better policies to change the country? So I think it would have been really, really interesting, but it would have been a completely different race than the one we see now.
Yeah, the establishment would not have been happy.
Right, yeah, exactly. Then where are you supposed to go with either of those? If you remember the establishment.
The question, did you have a question?
Yes. The assertion of objective corruption, I think. If my idea of the sort of start to finish history of American politics is that political briberies, whether formal or informal, as for political donations, if you can call it the same thing, have been a part of the institution going through. Whether they've been stopped, they've always found a way around it because the largest voter is always involved.
Right.
Because that is a manifestation of power, very solidly within capitalist society. What I wonder now is, we call Hillary the most corrupt, but doesn't it somewhat seem that these things existed beforehand, but we are in a relatively transparent age because of third parties like WikiLeaks actually making this stuff more available.
Right.
So it seems like she's the only one who's being the victim of a watershed moment when this is a long-running thing.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose my question is, as much as we demonize her during this current election cycle, how much can we really consider that going forward and in the past?
I would argue that the demonizing Clinton, as I said, because like for the past 30 years in the public sphere, she's had this reputation attached to her that is now more prominent at this point because she's in a more prominent position than being a senator or the first lady. But the idea of the Clintons as a political dynasty, and because of the fact that, yes, Here's the catch-22. I think most people who say that Hillary is crooked understand that politics is a game that's played like that. But why is Hillary Clinton's crookedness so important, I think, right? And I think the reason for that is, number one, she's been in the public sphere for the past 30 or 40 years. And then she was also associated with what people thought of Bill Clinton, right? And for better or for worse, she is Bill Clinton's wife. Like, there's no getting around that. So when you take a look at what people thought of the Clintons in general, and I think not only in terms of the Clinton Foundation, but in terms of how conservatives have viewed the Clintons, right? So much more focus has been put on both of them than I would argue almost any other politician who either hasn't, one, been impeached or resigned their office, or who hasn't been dismissed as someone who doesn't have a chance, like this corruption, to stop them. They've been the most successful at what they do. And now the argument going in, of course, is, did the Clinton Foundation accept donations and that kind of stuff from outside sources that were then used to politically motivate an organization that wasn't supposed to be politically motivated? And the thing is, if somebody tried hard enough, I bet you they could probably do the same thing to many other politicians. But because of her primacy in the spotlight and that kind of stuff, she's either earned that rep by what she's done, or that's been manufactured for her, as I said, from the media and the way in which she's in the public sphere. So again, if you think Hillary Clinton's corrupted, and maybe she is, and I think she is in some regards, but if you keep calling her corrupted over and over and over again, that starts to do the same kind of effect where people start to believe it even before investigating how she's corrupted, and then they take it to somewhere else.
Is there anything else here? Any other questions? Be happy to entertain any and all questions. I think it's very important to keep in mind at events like these that he does have the stage, but this is one speaker among many. Voices. There are many voices. There are a multitude of voices, especially here. We have a plurality of voices. The intent is to put them next to each other and see where they agree, see where they disagree, and see where you fit in. So what he says is not gold, but at the same time, what you think is not gold either. They must be battle tested, put together. Two people must come together and say, what do you believe? What do I believe? Where do we go from here? And I think that this was an example, an exhibit of what that takes and what that's like. So thank you all very, very much for coming. Another question? Yeah, please.
Like the third debate, I know like Jameson said that Trump was said he would not let the result of the elections. He might let the results of the elections stand. What is your response to that?
So, as we've just talked about in terms of what we consider politics to be and the way that it's gone, even though people have been politics as being a corrupt game and that kind of stuff, there have been a couple ground rules that everybody's kind of followed, and one of them is that there's been this peaceful transition of power from one president to the other. There was a note that was written by George H.W. Bush to Bill Clinton after he won the election in 1992, where even though he'd just been defeated by Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush essentially blessed Bill Clinton's presidency and that kind of stuff and said, I want the best for you and your family. He gave him a little bit of advice, even when you feel like the world's against you, don't let that crush you inside and that kind of stuff. These very nonpartisan, almost humanistic understandings of how in order to keep the democracy the way that is or to have a functioning country, we can't let this kind of stuff split us in that regard. Now, obviously Donald Trump being a political outsider, he said that comment in the third debate, which blew up all the headlines, and ironically, again, made the third debate, which was the most about policy of the three, more about what he said than about the actual policy. But that's kind of terrifying to me in a way, because if he says, well, I'm not going to accept the way in which our government works, which is, again, when one candidate loses, technically they're supposed to then say, you know what, we're still one nation, and this other person beat me through the democratic process, and that's about it. Every single candidate from what I can remember has done that in terms of the last two. So for him to say that, I respect the way in which he's putting forth his rhetoric and that kind of stuff and the strategy and stuff that we talked about here, from a marketing standpoint, regardless of their moral implications. But to say something like that, I believe, is, again, just out of bounds coming from anyone, where it's if you're going to be a politician, you're going to engage in this process, you have to respect the fact that in order for the good of the country, it needs to be a peaceful transition of power. And he needs to be, that's going to be the most interesting part, where if Hillary Clinton wins tomorrow night, will Donald Trump continue that assertion that he put forth in the third debate, or will he counter himself?
And will she win? Or will he win?
Right.
Stay tuned.
Will Gary Johnson win?
Tomorrow we will have another meeting about the results. We'll talk about more stuff. It'll be very, very exciting. But thank you all so much for coming. Another round of applause for Karl. Very, very good. Very, very good. Lots to consider before this very important day tomorrow. Get out and vote if you have not. But of course, keep thinking, thinking, and thinking. It's great, man. Thanks very much for coming. This was super fun. Wow. That was about rhetoric. I would like points I had not seen, point by point, was so very, very fine tuned. I really appreciate that.
Thanks so much, Carl.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was good. It was very good. Dr. Tim really was exactly right. So.